For those few of you online who do not know me, my name is Dr. Bridget Goodman. I am Associate Professor of Multilingual Education at Nazarbayev University. I've been at Nazarbayev University in the multilingual education program since 2014. And I've been presenting at conferences since before some of you were born, I just realized, but that's okay. So what I'm going to do today is, let me start the slideshow and share it. Oops. I wanted to talk to as many people as I can about how to apply to and present at international conferences, both face-to-face and virtual versions. And what I want to do today is first talk about finding conferences, then talk about the process of applying, then if you're accepted, about preparing your presentation, about how to network during the conference, and then how I think NUGSE can help you through these other 4 steps. But before I do that, and especially since we have some current students and alumni here, I just want to take a moment to ask you a warm-up question. Have you yourself ever presented at an international conference? So if you have, you can either type yes or no in the chat, or you can click the yes or no button on the reaction bar on Zoom. And let's see, I know at least one of you has, because you were in the picture on the first page. So Igrim has, Kajmbek, yes. Anyone else? No, Marina says no, not yet. I like that attitude, Jana. No. Okay. Well, that's okay. That's good. This presentation is designed for people who haven't had this experience yet. But Igrim, if you don't mind, as I talk, I might call on you if you have any additional thoughts to share, because what I am presenting today is based on my experience, both as someone who has applied to and presented at conferences, as someone who has reviewed proposals for conferences, and as someone who has mentored NUGSE students in this process. But Igrim is well positioned to talk about these things from the perspective of a student who has actually participated in international conferences. All right, so let's move on. The first is about finding conferences. And again, this came from my experience of having students come to my office and say, oh, Bridget, I heard about this conference. I'm thinking about applying. What do you think? And I would look at it and try and figure out, well, how can I make sure that, you know, this is a reliable conference? So I've made here a list of Bridget rules of when to run to apply to a conference and when to run away from it. So the first is to think about, how did you hear about the conference itself? So most of the conferences that I hear about, a lot of them come through listservs. So I sign up for different lists that are important in my field. I'm in applied linguistics and language education. So for example, come on. So here's an email I got from NALDC, which apparently is the National Subject Association for English as Additional Language Learning in the United Kingdom. And they are organizing a conference in November on EAL perspectives on decolonizing the curriculum. And in their call, they have a list, they have a description of what types of presentations they're expecting at the conference, the general themes, the formats, and the names and credentials of the keynote speakers, so that you know that you're going to hear experts in the field talking to everybody, but also opportunities to hear presentations within this topic. You'll also notice that email came from an international association. So that one came from the British Association of Applied Linguistics. The American Association of Applied Linguistics has similar offerings. The American Educational Research Association, or the Kazakh Educational Research Association, Comparative and International Education Society, and their regional organizations, they may all offer conferences. These organizations also often advertise their conferences on social media, on Facebook, on Twitter, and for CIS for this year, we're also trying to advertise on Instagram because we know students use that more. If I get an email directly from a person that I don't know, or from an organization I don't know saying apply to this conference, then I'm more likely to run away, unless it's been forwarded to me by someone that I know, but I don't trust that. The frequency of these conferences, usually they're once a year, or in some cases, they are every 2 years. The one exception, there's an organization in Europe that organized in the before times 3 to 4 conferences a year. But each one had a different theme and very major speakers in the field of applied linguistics. When I see that a conference is being organized monthly, I'm very skeptical. It takes a tremendous amount of work and time and money to organize a conference. So someone is organizing it monthly. They're probably just renting a hotel and giving you a chance to have a free holiday in Turkey or Spain. In terms of the topic, again, there's usually a specific theme. And when I say specific, you know, the CIS conference this year is about idealism, but there are many sub-themes. Other conferences will say applied linguistics, and within that, they give, you know, translanguaging or second language acquisition or learning strategies. You can tell that it's very relevant to specific areas of the field. If I see one that just says it's about science education, that it's open for all disciplines, I become a little suspicious. Because the whole point of the conference is to bring people together who have clearly defined research and teaching and practice interests. Again, I look at the speakers and the organizers. Do I recognize the names of the keynote speakers? Do I recognize the names and institutions of the organizing committee? If there's none of that, or if they're all from some tiny university in India that I've never heard of, again, I become skeptical. Now, I'm talking about major international conferences. Of course, there are many local and regional conferences that are also worth going to. So it's equally important to get, you know, knowledge and feedback in the region as abroad. But I'm also assuming that if you're applying to a conference in Almaty or Bishkek or Armenia, that you have your own networks and own ways of evaluating the quality of that conference. I'm talking about conferences that are advertising in English, basically. And then finally, publishing. So sometimes the organization itself has its own journal that is ranked Q1 or Q2, like the TESOL conference has the TESOL quarterly journal. The CIS has Comparative Education Review. Other conferences will offer to let you publish in their conference proceedings. So we have a former graduate who presented at the EuroCall, the European Computer Assisted Language Learning Conference, and is about to have his presentation published in their conference proceedings. This is even much more common in engineering, but there are also opportunities in education. If I see in the advertisement that they guarantee publication 2 weeks after the event, then I get nervous. not only is that way too fast, but they shouldn't be guaranteeing even a conference proceeding should go through some form of peer review to make sure that it's quality. Are there any questions at this point or comments, things to add? Going once, going twice. Okay, then moving on to step 2, applying. The first step is to read the call for papers. So I'm going to shift over now to CIES. Right, so they have the conference theme. Right, and they got very interesting this year. They came up with these very beautifully worded themes and sub-themes about the impact of COVID-19 on education, thinking about the politics and economics of education, climate change, curriculum, imagining a future, very broad, very creative. As I said, the other one was about English as an additional language and subject context. So every conference will have, some kind of, and journals as well, will have some kind of theme, some kind of scope of work, not scope of work, some kind of theme, some kind of scope of the types of presentations they're expecting. So you have to ask yourself, if my research is, on the history of English or the history of the Kazakh language, does it really fit in any of these themes? And the answer is no. But maybe there's something in the British Association of Applied Linguistics, maybe someone is organizing a conference on language change across the centuries. And then you go, aha, my work is a fit. The next thing is to decide which type of presentation you will make. So if you, and I apologize, the CIS website's not very friendly, but see here they have proposal formats. So the most typical is a formal paper presentation. I will tell you a secret, most people don't actually write the paper before they present it. Although some conferences require you to submit a paper before presenting. But the idea here is that you have usually conducted empirical research, and you present your presentation the way you present it in the paper, with an introduction about the context, about the purpose and research questions, your literature review and frameworks briefly, your methods briefly, your findings, and your conclusions and implications. Unless it's a different type of topic, but that's the typical research presentation. And it's done orally, it's done live, usually with PowerPoint or Prezi, and the time can be anywhere from 10 to 20 minutes. At this conference, they're saying you'll have 12 to 15 minutes, and that you have to write an abstract of up to 1,000 words. If you have enough friends writing and researching on the same topic, you can organize a group presentation. The other type is a poster presentation. And in the before times, you printed out a PowerPoint as a large poster, and you stood next to it, and people came up to you individually, and you talked about your work. Many times the poster presentation is as rigorous as a formal paper presentation. But for young scholars, for new scholars who are afraid to stand in front of a room in English and talk to a bunch of strangers, this can be a little bit more friendly format for starting a conference. It's also good if your work is still in progress. Poster presentation is a way to get some ideas out, but they're both good formats, and I'll show you in the presentation a little bit later what a poster presentation looks like. In the online format, I've seen it done different ways. Some conferences ask you to record a 3-minute speech about your poster and upload it. Others just ask you to upload the poster by itself, and then people scroll down and read it like they're reading a web page. So the experience is a little bit different, but close to what it was before. Then there are roundtable presentations. Again, it's a more informal sit-down conversation about your work. And again, it can still be a research study, but if you're still in the very early stages, you're still thinking some things through, again, this can feel a little bit safer. And I'm not sure how they're organizing this in an online mode. This is probably designed for face-to-face. And then they have some other special visual art workshops, new scholars workshops. So, and we're trying to encourage multilingual presentations as well. So there are a lot of different options that you have to think about. Also at these larger conferences like CIES or American Association of Applied Linguistics, there are many different subgroups. So if you look here, there are these special interest groups depending on your specific area of interest. It's not listed here, but there is one for language issues, which is the one that I'm involved with. There's one for higher education. There's one specifically on Eurasia, which basically includes the former Soviet countries of Europe and Central Asia. There's one on early childhood development. There's one on Africa. There's one on Latin America. Sometimes these groups get together and have a joint presentation, like language issues in Africa, or global literacy in Africa, or mathematics education in Eurasia. So again, you have to know what your niche is. Know the requirements for the written submissions, know the word limits. Again, the poster session was 500 words. The paper presentation was 1,000. That's actually really long for a conference presentations. A lot of them, the limit is 200 or 300 words because people don't have time to read. And because people don't have time to read. And what I was going to say is some conference sites, you have to cut and paste your proposal from Word into the conference software. And if you're at 301 words, the software just cuts off the last word. So if you don't keep to those limits, you won't have a complete and clear proposal. You need to know what components, what are they asking for in that proposal. Some are very specific. You have to list 5 references. You have to, have an introduction, methodology, findings, conclusions. You need to know the deadlines. So the CIES conference, their deadline is October 20th. Now they don't say what time that is or what time zone. That's also important, especially here. You might actually have until early morning the 30th or the 21st, but you've got to double check. And then whenever possible, you want to find the evaluation criteria. It's not on the CIS website. I have to show it to you somewhere else. But many conferences will say proposals will be evaluated according to the following, and they'll have a list. Sometimes that will include a match to the conference theme. And if you have questions about any of these things because it's your first time applying, ask. I just got an email the other day about someone asking about formats and people limits for certain kinds of workshops. And I couldn't answer the question, but I could refer them to someone who could. I will also show you now, because I've worked as a reviewer for CIES, how we review proposals. And I think this list is good. And when in doubt, it's a good guideline to follow for most conferences. So the first is relevance. So for CIS, the question is the topic related to comparative and international education? Is it related to the conference theme and or the special interest group that you've submitted to? So it doesn't have to be all of those things, but it has to be at least one of those things. And the more of those buttons it hits, the higher the rating will go. Now, the good news is, in our conference, if someone submits to our SIG, the language issues SIG, and we read it and go, you know what, this looks like a great proposal, but it's really about economics. We can talk to the conference organizers and say, can we move this over to another SIG and let them decide if it fits with them? And other SIGs have done the same with us. They've said, oh, this really belongs in language issues. If you're with CIS, if you're not sure, you can also go into the general pool. What that means is when you're accepted and you're put with other presenters, they might be talking about something completely different from your study. Whereas if you're in a special interest group, they try and put papers that have at least one connection between them. Theory or context. So, for a research presentation, we need to see that you have a strong theoretical framework or some other kind of contextualization of your study within scholarly research. Now, actually, this has been updated for CIS as well, because now there are different types of presentations. There's theoretical, there's research, there's theoretical, and then there's like practical. And so the criteria are a little bit different. So this is for research, but each one has its own criteria. So that can change a little bit. Inquiry, the strength of your analysis, the strength of your research methods. Do you say, oh, we conducted surveys and interviews? Well, don't just tell me you did surveys and interviews. Tell me how many people you surveyed. Tell me how many people you interviewed. Tell me if you used random sampling or convenient sampling or snowball sampling or purposeful sampling. And, cite Creswell, cite Cohen. Findings. We're looking at the clarity and coherence in the presentation of findings or argument. So again, can I understand, how you got to these conclusions? Now, in some cases, you're applying to a conference before you have actually completed collecting the data and writing the reports. In that case, you write what you think you're going to find. You say, preliminary analysis suggests that. In some cases, particularly with dissertations, I've been told, some people will even, if they haven't started data collection yet, they will just present their literature review and theoretical framework and get feedback on that. In fact, I had actually, Myra, I think Myra, it wasn't, you presented a lit review at a conference in the UAE that was based on coursework we did, a final paper for my class. So, if they don't have these strict criteria for empirical research, those opportunities exist. And again, if you're not sure, you can email the organizers and ask. Contribution. Is there a scholarly originality or contribution to existing knowledge? Or if this is a practice-oriented presentation, what is its application to existing scholarly knowledge? So again, they differentiate a little bit between research and practice-oriented presentations. If you're actually, teaching kids in Africa how to read, or teaching teachers in Africa how to teach reading. How does this help us better understand language issues or Eurasian issues in the world? So I call this the ooh factor. Do I read it and go, ooh, I haven't seen anyone do that before. I haven't seen anyone talk about this before. I haven't seen anyone use this framework this way before. Or is it, oh God, another translanguaging paper, I've seen it all already. And at American Association of Applied Linguistics, they're pretty strict about this. And then the reviewers will rate the proposals up to 4 points on each of these criteria. And then the higher, and usually there's 2 or 3 reviewers that read it, and their scores are averaged. So the higher the average score, the better chance you have of getting your proposal accepted. Now, again, the dirty secret is there are people like me who will look at those scores and go, okay, these 2 people gave very high scores, this person gave a low score, but they're not an experienced reviewer. And we look at the proposal again and go, oh no, this is still worthy, and we'll let it in. But other places are more competitive and stricter and say, no, we have to have a cutoff score. The other thing is CIES, and I don't know how they're going to do it in the hybrid format, but in fully face-to-face and fully online, they have said, this is how many slots you have. You can accept up to 20 presentations and no more. So if we have 50 proposals and we can only accept 20, then we have to use these criterion rankings in order to decide, who gets accepted and who doesn't. So, following all of these guidelines and communicating your study as clearly as possible according to the guidelines and criteria of each conference is important. All right, any questions about that or comments? Igarim says no questions. Okay, Kelisa. So let's assume, congratulations, you're now accepted. Now you must prepare your presentation. And in these interesting times that we are living in, as the Chinese proverb goes, there are a few new questions you have to ask yourself or ask the organizers. And sometimes they won't know or tell you until pretty close to the conference time. Number one is the presentation live, or do you record and upload a file, or both? So I attended AAAL online, and all of the presentations except for the keynote presentations were recorded and uploaded. And you just watched them on demand, right? It was like Netflix, but for conferences. Right? Okay, I want to, it's 2 a.m. where the conference site should have been, but I'm awake, so I'll click now and watch. In CIES last year, all of the presentations were live. And the time zone was pegged to Eastern time zone. So me and my students were online at midnight here in Nur Sultan, giving or chairing the presentation. The craziest was this summer, but I heard that it was modeled on another conference with a similar format where you had to record the presentation and upload it, but then still attend a live session to summarize the presentation and answer questions. Which also meant I was up at 4 a.m. in the middle of the night. And yet we had 20 people show up and we had questions go pretty much to the end of the 90 minutes. I was stunned, but it worked. So, but you have to find out what these requirements are. You have to find out what the recording formats or requirements are. Sometimes they'll only accept files with certain extensions or certain size limits. Again, it's essential to know what your time limit is. I've been to conferences in Kazakhstan. I know how things work here. The keynote speaker gets to talk as long as they want because they're the keynote speaker. And suddenly, the conference runs 2 hours late. The international conferences don't work that way. Especially if you're face to face, but also if you're live. As I pointed out earlier, in each session, there are 3, 4, or 5 presentations. So each one is timed to allow a certain number of minutes for presentation, a certain number of minutes for questions and answers, and a certain number of minutes for people to come and go. So some sessions are 90 minutes with 3 presentations, and each presenter gets 20 minutes to present and 10 minutes for question and answer. And a lot of times face to face, what I do is I go to presentation number 1 in room number 1, and then I go to presentation number 2 in room number 2, and then I come back to room number 1 for the 3rd presentation, or I go to room number 4 for the last presentation. But if everyone's timing is off, I can't do that. Also, sometimes there's a 90-minute time slot, and then the next group of presentations is scheduled 15 minutes after that. So if you go 20 minutes over your time limit, now everybody's off. And most importantly is, if you don't keep to the time limit, what's going to happen is, someone's going to tell you, you have 5 minutes left, you have 2 minutes left, you have no minutes left. And maybe you have spent the whole 20 minutes giving your introduction and your lit review, and now you have no time for the rest of the presentation, even though the rest of the presentation is the most important part. Ask yourself, do you have a clean, well-lit space with working internet if you have to be online? And do you have a plan B for the live sessions if your internet is not working? Are you able to go to your phone? Are you able to go to your office? And I put these last 2 up here. You see, normally I'm using a Zoom background because my apartment is disgusting. I don't want anyone to see my apartment. But when I presented at the British Association of Applied Linguistics in September, they weren't using Zoom. They were using Blackboard. Was it Blackboard or Adobe Connect? One of those. Anyway, it was a software that didn't allow virtual backgrounds. And thankfully, they provided a test so that I could log in and make sure the software worked on my computer before the conference so I could find this out. And so suddenly I'm like, okay, I have to figure out where to put the computer in my apartment so that you don't see the disaster that is my apartment. And then I have to make sure the lighting's right. And, my brother would still be upset with me if he saw, how poorly lit my face was. I looked like Phantom of the Opera because half my face was dark. But these are things you want to think about, and audio quality as well. Sometimes, you can turn off the video, but if you're trying to show a PowerPoint, that makes it challenging. So these are things you have to think about. And if it's too much, maybe you withdraw from the conference. I don't know, but I hope it doesn't come to that. But this is why sometimes asynchronous is better, uploading a video, because then people can watch it anytime and it works anytime. But you don't always have a choice. I mean, it's the organizers of the conference who make that choice. All you can do is ask beforehand, before you apply, if they have thought about this yet. Okay. So I've already touched on one of these points, but as you prepare the actual PowerPoint or poster itself, beware of too much text. Use color, use graphics. Some of you are much better than I am at using fancy software such as Prezi, where you click a button and the PowerPoint zooms in at you. For empirical research, oops, I went too far. For empirical research, don't spend too much time on introduction and lit review, and provide it briefly, provide enough of the context, but you want to make sure you have time for findings and conclusions. The other dirty secret is, if the presentation time ends and you don't have time to talk about conclusions, usually the chair will say, oh, I have a question about your conclusions, and they'll give you an extra minute to present those. But what will help with that is to rehearse your timings. And in PowerPoint, right, you can record the slideshow with timings, and you can practice talking, and it will record how long it takes you to present each slide. And so if you're taking 30 minutes to present and you only have 15, you can either speak faster or cut some of your slides or move some of the extra slides to the end of the talk. And if someone asks a question, you say, oh, I'm so happy you asked that question, and you go to that slide. Which gets to my other point, which is backwards, is think about what your audience doesn't know. Right? If you're presenting about Kazakhstan, don't assume that they know where Kazakhstan is or that it has its own language called Kazakh. Don't assume that they know what trilingual education policy is or what MOES stands for. In fact, at these conferences, a lot of the questions that come up at the end of the talk, if you're presenting from Kazakhstan, are about Kazakhstan itself rather than your actual research. So you want to give them a little bit of that background information, and sometimes even a map to help guide the talk. Okay. Any questions about that? Нет, всё молчат, хорошо. So the next thing is now you're at the conference. And one of the functions of a conference, I mean, one is of course sharing your research, but another function is networking, is getting to know people with similar professional interests, right? To expand your professional network and open up opportunities for employment, for research, for writing. I started going to CIES in 2014 when it was in Toronto. And since then, I have multiple publications with people that I've met at the conference. We have brought visiting professors to Kazakhstan who were people who I met at the conference. I'm getting ready now to start a new research project with someone that I met online at the British Association of Applied Linguistics conference. So I'm going to talk about networking in the virtual and the face-to-face environment, because as you see from this diagram, there are definitely some differences, but there are some overlaps as well. So face-to-face, if you are fortunate enough to be able to attend a conference again, the most common networking, actually, I'll add one more here. And they're kind of connected, but many of these conferences will organize events. They will organize happy hours. I mean, in the before times, the language issues SIG would arrange for the members to go to a restaurant and to have a couple of drinks and have some snacks and to talk to each other. There are also formal receptions. Sometimes there's an opening reception for the entire conference. At CIES, oftentimes there are individual organizations like the University of Pennsylvania or the University of Michigan or certain SIGs that will have receptions where people, again, they get free food, free hors d'oeuvres, they get free drinks or paid drinks, and they walk around the room and they stand at little tables and they start talking to each other and start asking each other about where they're from and what they're working on, and see if they have common interests to discuss further. This can also happen over lunch at coffee breaks. Again, some conferences will organize lunch and coffee breaks and provide all that food for you. In other cases, you, especially in the US, you're on your own. So, but another then related networking point is after presentations. So maybe you go see a presentation, which is what happened at the British Association of Applied Linguistics. You see a presentation, go, wow, I see a lot of common interests between what this person's presenting and what I'm working on. So maybe after the presentation, you go up to that person and say, oh, you know, your work is really interesting. I think we're working on similar things. You know, can we have lunch? Can we have dinner? Can we go grab a cup of coffee now and talk about your work and my work? Okay. Now, this may seem a little bit scary, you know, especially if you're a young researcher and you're watching presentations from full professors. So start with peers, start with people who are also graduate students. And in fact, some conferences have special sessions just for graduate students. All right, so go to those sessions and network there. In the virtual space, it depends on how the conference is set up. The best conferences that I've been to, and when I say best, I mean, it's been very easy for me to network at these conferences, is they have a special conference software that has individual links to presenters. So again, I watched this woman's presentation about English medium education in China. And I went, wow, there's a lot of interesting things happening in that study. So I found her name on the conference site, and through the conference site, I sent her a private message. I said, hi, my name is Bridget. I do this kind of work. I saw your presentation. It was very interesting. Can we talk further? Well, she got all excited. You know, she found my email address. She wrote back to me. We had a Zoom meeting, and we've exchanged each other's articles. In fact, I have a lot of homework now. I have to read all of her articles and figure out how I'm going to replicate her and her master's student study in Kazakhstan. There are also, you know, one of the things I love about conferences is running into people I haven't seen in a while. So, but again, at British Association of Applied Linguistics, there was an NU alum who presented her thesis research. So again, I attended her presentation. I sent her a message through that same software. In some cases, if you're lucky, the presentation software will be set up so that you can send private messages to the other people attending the presentation. At CIS, they didn't allow that. So I could see that my friends were in the presentation, but I had to go to my computer and find their email address and send them an email message while I was watching the conference. But then for people that I didn't know but wanted to talk to, I didn't have that option because they didn't have a way to communicate with people that you don't know, which I think is very unfortunate. In fact, I should probably write to CIS Oversight Committee and mention that or ask that question. But this is immensely helpful. Otherwise, the alternative is to see their name, see their presentation, and then stalk them on social media, to look on Facebook, to look on Instagram, to see if they have an account and send them a message. Okay. At both, whether it's face-to-face or virtual, again, all conferences often will have specific networking events or networking rooms. I myself have not found that useful, but those spaces are there. Business meetings. I used to think, oh, why would I go to a business meeting? That's so boring. But each group and subgroup of a conference will have a business meeting. And it's another way to meet people who share common interests. And the last thing I'll say is, if you in terms of after presentations, if you can ask a question during a presentation and make it a good question, and if you get a good response, now you have an opening of a dialogue to follow up with the person afterwards. So I'll admit I used this trick in 2020. I mean, not used this trick, but I used this strategy in 2020. There was a keynote presenter at a fireside chat, and I asked my PhD student, I encouraged her to ask a question in the chat, and she did, and she got a response. And then I followed up with the keynote speaker and said, would you mind being the examiner of my PhD student's dissertation? And she said yes. Right? Because now she has some awareness of this person, some context for saying yes. Another strategy I saw, and again, this was the before time, so it was face-to-face. But this emerging scholar went to the keynote speakers and said, I'm giving a talk. Would you mind coming to my presentation? So she had really senior scholars in the room with her giving feedback. I thought that was brave, but also smart, because now they know who she is. They know her name. They know the power of her work. And it was a really good presentation too. So again, if you're shy, if you get accepted, you can and should advertise your presentation on your social media, right? So that people know and will participate. Okay, I see we have 2 questions in the chat. No? Okay. Any questions or comments there? I've got, I think, one more slide left, and then I will stop because I've been talking for almost 50 minutes, which is kind of embarrassing, but that's what happens when you get old and have too much experience and not enough time to share it. All right. So last but not least, how does NUGSE help? First of all, we help by identifying and promoting conferences, right? Oftentimes we, through our networks, hear about conferences and we share that information with other people. My last face-to-face conference was in Morocco in 2020 in January, because my colleague from Morocco said, this year, this major conference is being organized in my home country. And so I went and presented at a roundtable with another colleague. You get help by designing course assignments that then become conference presentations. So the master's thesis is the most typical assignment for a course presentation, but you can see here in this picture, this is a class that I used to teach, Multilingual Society, and I used to ask students to prepare a poster about a multilingual speech community in the world. This student's poster is about the Chinese speech community in Malaysia. And we've had students present that exact poster, or that, that exact assignment at a conference in Almaty. We've had other students present posters formatted like this, but based on their thesis work in Norway, for example. The best was, I had a group of students who did an activity for the multilingual school course, and they presented the results. They had asked school children to fill in a picture with different colors and locations representing their languages. It's called a plurilingual portrait. And another presenter at that conference, a postdoctoral scholar from Hong Kong who was in Sweden, an hour before had presented the exact same activity, but done in the Hong Kong English medium context. And when she saw our students presenting the exact same activity that she had just presented, her face lit up, because she saw, wow, we're doing the same thing. we are connected in this space. The other thing, two things that GSE can do is your professors and even your peers can guide you in the process of applying and preparing your presentation. I have read and given feedback on abstracts before students submit them. And one year a student said, well, because you did that, Bridget, I got accepted. The students who did not do that did not get accepted. The same with PowerPoint presentations. I've reviewed PowerPoints. We have academic English instructors who give talks specifically on PowerPoint presentations. And then finally, there's funding for travel and registration fees. And here I say limitations apply. They're developing the business travel guidelines for students for 2022. They're still going to be pretty strict, but those spaces are slowly opening up. They definitely pay for registration at online conferences if you're presenting online. The travel funding has been limited. It's usually just enough to get the flight to Europe. But again, that was before pandemic. That was before the tenge went up over 400 tenge. And even then, you know, students had to find ways to supplement or save costs. So it's not, you know, perfect, but it's better than nothing. Well, I hate to end on that note. So I'll close by saying that I hope this has given you a lot to think about, but I hope in general this has given you some encouragement in future plans to present at conferences. So thank you very much. I will now stop sharing and open the floor for questions. Daži ili na ruskom, Kazakhsha, if Aidana or someone else can translate.
Sure. Thank you, Bridget. It was just interesting, and you shared some, you know, insights of the faculty member. Any
Maybe
questions so far? Oh yeah, we have one question from Munira.
Does NUG itself, JSE itself, organize some educational conferences if I want to start as an attendee listener? We have not done that since, was it 20? Do you remember what year it was? We had the Kira conference. Was it 2017 or 18?
I guess it was 17, I guess.
Thank you, Aigerim. Always my institutional memory. I can remember which cohort. I just can't remember. Yeah. So, you know, problem number one is it takes a lot of time and energy to organize these conferences. And problem number two is when we've talked about it in the past, it's, you know, the university has been, you know, reluctant to help contribute funding for organizing the conferences. And, you know, in some places they get a grant and they use the grant to organize a conference, but our grant guidelines say we are prohibited from using our grants to organize conferences. So, you know, in a perfect world, I would love to organize conferences, but at the moment it doesn't happen. Oh, Bayan is here. Oh, did you hear me talking about you? Bayan presented her thesis work in Norway. That was in 2018. And Maldir, oh my God, I showed your picture at the beginning from when you were all in Germany. Oh. So again, there are, you know, if you don't want to talk to me, there are many people on this call who are familiar with this experience at a very personal level. So if any of them want to comment, the floor is open.
Bridget, have you ever participated in those of conferences that are organized at either the Süleyman Demirel University or KIMEP? I know they do some annual conferences as well on the languages, right?
Both. Well, let me think a minute. I've definitely been to two KIMEP conferences. I went to the conference that was in person. God, what year was that? That must have been 2018. And then I did the online conference this year at KIMEP. And Suleiman Demirel, they've had that foreign language teaching and applied linguistics conference, but I can't remember if I went to that or if I presented at the winter school and sought advertisements for it. I do know the guy who was organizing those conferences is now in Uzbekistan. So I went to that same conference online last December when he organized it in Uzbekistan, and that was lovely. I definitely enjoyed that.
I see. So coming back to the question of Munira's question, I recommend that there are also other Kazakhstani universities who are hosting different, conferences on the languages if you're interested in. So please, they usually share information on Facebook and maybe university websites as well.
Absolutely. And I haven't heard about any for 2022, but I'll definitely keep my eyes open. Also, GSE will pay for one local and one international conference. So if you're interested in going to a local conference, they will pay those fees as well. Okay, thank you, Munira. Always with the good questions. Еще вопросы? Срыта Барма. You're welcome, Bayan. And you're welcome, Moldir. No other questions?
So if we don't have any other questions, I will stop recording and let the MA people stay here if you want to.
Oh yeah, reunion time.
Sure.
You're welcome, Aizat.